Saif here, and welcome to another episode of Silicon and Steel. Today we're going to review a top-notch amplifier, the Kenwood KAC 9104D mono amp. Kenwood makes a whole line of car audio amplifiers, but this one is the most powerful. It's a Class D mono amplifier, meaning that it's built to power subwoofers. We'll come back around later to talk about these stats, but let's get them out there. According to the stats, this amplifier pushes 1800 watts at peak power, 900 watts RMS for one channel at 2 ohms, or 500 watts RMS for one channel at 4 ohms. Just an FYI, you want to rate the power of an amp based on its RMS rather than its peak power output, because the RMS power is what the amp can continuously produce, rather than what it can achieve for a brief period. So, 1800 watts peak and 900 watts RMS at 2 ohms. Pretty impressive. In fact, too impressive to be totally true. Lots of audio companies market amplifier powers based on a 14.4 volt input. Some cars have alternators and batteries that can provide that much power, but most stock car batteries only push 12.5 volts. Brilliant marketing because you get to put bigger numbers on your packaging, but it's kind of misleading. Just so you know, if your car has a battery output of 12.5 volts, you can more reasonably expect about 80% of the output promised on the box for this amplifier, and many other amps for that matter, so check in the future. That means this Kenwood amp produces closer to about 1440 watts peak, 720 RMS at 2 ohms. All of that aside, this is still a very powerful amplifier. At 720 watts at 2 ohms, this thing can still make a lot of noise. Plus, in addition to this thing being able to provide an enormous amount of steady and clean power, it looks good and it's loaded with other nice features. In terms of looks, this amp is sleek enough to be installed just about anywhere. Of course, I guess you could hide it under a seat or on your trunk ceiling, but I wouldn't shy away from installing it in a more visible place. In fact, the lights here and here can create a cool blue and red effect in your cabin or trunk if you install it well. More importantly, in terms of features, this amp has plenty of input, dial, and control options, but is still simple and user-friendly. Flipping it over, here you can see that there is an RCA in, which I would recommend using, and an RCA out if you want to link multiple amps. To the left here, you have the input sensitivity, the LPF frequency, and bass boost dials. Unless you really know what you're doing, I would recommend leaving these settings at their default levels. But if you feel like experimenting, go nuts. It's your gear. You aren't likely to damage it by messing with the settings, but you might not figure out how to truly optimize sound quality either. Okay. Other Kenwood KAC amps, which this is one of, particularly their 4-channel speaker amps, have a bunch of switches under their faceplate. Opening this one up, just give a second. Alright. You can see that this mono amp doesn't have any of the other sort of switches like their 4-channel speaker amp does. Removing this faceplate lets you get to these screws, but it doesn't reveal any other tuning options. So I'm going to leave this off for now. Finally, I want to take a minute to talk about some install considerations for this amp. First, this amplifier has 2 fans on the front side to keep it cool during use. Many other amps opt for the aluminum heatsink instead of fans, which works well but severely limits your install options. Heat rises, so when you install an amp with a heatsink, the heatsink always has to be on top for it to work properly, meaning that if you want to install it in an inverted way or sideways, out of the question for amps with heatsinks, which is kind of terrible. Since this amp has fans, you can install it at any orientation you want without worrying about it overheating. Just don't obstruct the fans, and you'll be fine. When I was using this amp, I had it installed both upside down on the ceiling of my trunk and sideways drilled into the back of my rear seats. Worked beautifully with no problems. Second, this thing has onboard fuses. Sounds really great, and in most respects it is. But if you're going to rely on these fuses rather than installing a fuse on your power line, make sure you install this amp in a place where you can get to these fuses. This thing produces a lot of power, so you're sure to have to replace these fuses at some point. That said, I would recommend buying and installing a capacitor with this amp because it will not only improve your system, but it will protect the amp from power surges as well. Just make sure you install a fuse between the battery and the capacitor, or you could end up with a blown capacitor. Been there, done that, don't let it happen to you. In conclusion, this is a powerful and reliable amp that you can get for around $170 nowadays. I'll include links to other information and to places you can pick one up in my description below. If you're on the fence about buying this amp, go for it. I use this one to power 2 JL 12-inch W3V3 subs and it never disappointed. As always, I hope you enjoyed this review. If you're so inclined, please subscribe and leave comments. Feedback and questions are always welcome. Until next episode, Syph signing off. Stay sharp.